Good morning, everyone. This is Doug. This is podcast number 3 of the Jesus Words Only channel, and we are hoping that you will find this new format interesting, and many of you have asked for it, so I'm going to now include it. I will have somebody interviewing me each time, and today in this series coming, it will be Deb, and hope you enjoy the episodes. Please give us your feedback. Okay, take care.
Hi, everyone. This is Doug. We have a guest podcast questioner of Doug, and her name is Deborah. And she's living in a foreign country. No, she lives here somewhere in America, but we're going to be keep her secret identity from her attackers. No, I'm kidding.
It feels like a foreign country sometimes, but
All right, Deborah. So just give us a little background on you. What is your profession and what's your family life like? And why are you interested in talking to me over the Zoom?
well, I am a professor of sociology. I've been teaching at a small liberal arts college for about 15 years, maybe. And I teach pretty general topics in sociology. And as to how I came across your channel, Doug, I'm not really sure. But I do enjoy just learning more about, biblical studies. And I'm sure that one of your videos came across my feed at some point and I clicked on it. I think it might honestly have been the one with the woman in the car. Do you know
Oh, the
which one I'm
woman
talking
yelling,
about?
I'm gonna, she was
Yes.
very angry at the man.
Exactly. I think it might have been that short.
Uh,
Um, and so as it sometimes goes, it takes a while to listen to somebody's videos a couple times before you begin to recognize their voice. And at some point I thought, oh, it's that guy again, and I started to be more of an active subscriber in your channel. So
oh,
um,
good.
so yeah.
So we were thinking about discussing some origins of the channel. I suppose you wanted to ask me about that and, my experience maybe in Costa Rica or things like that. So I'm going to leave it open to you to identify questions, and then I'll try the best I can to answer them.
Right. Yeah. So exactly. I became curious about your background a bit. And so I reached out to you and you were kind enough to respond and not just respond, but allow me to ask you some questions. So this is a treat for me. I don't know about you, but I think that knowing where someone's coming from uh, it can be an important part of assessing their arguments and their ideas. Maybe it shouldn't be, but I think it does make a difference. And so far, what I've heard from you makes me think that if more people might listen to some of your findings more carefully, the more I've heard about your background. So I thought maybe I'm not the only one who's interested in your experience of this work and how it's all led up to this point. So those are some of the questions I thought maybe I could ask in this particular interview session, if that sounds good.
That's good. But in the law, we call that getting the background on the witness so that we can know that whether they're true or not true, or they're coming from a good place or a bad place. So I think that's a very good starting point.
All
Let's do
right,
that.
excellent. All right. And maybe you can jump in and decide how much detail you'd like to give. I've listened to your video on Costa Rica. We could maybe link that in the description. And I think that you have a video maybe on your pizzeria experience that I'll reference. So
Yeah, yeah. Am I
uh,
getting too much change back when I
right,
was 14 years old, I think it was.
right, exactly. So my first question has to do with what I see as maybe it's not a pattern. I think it probably is a pattern, but it's a congruence uh, between the early story of how you became a Christian and then your later investigations into the Pauline doctrine. So,
Okay.
if you want to give more background, you can. But what I noticed a couple similarities in those stories. But it struck me, Doug, because a lot of times when people have a conundrum or a dilemma or there's some kind of debate going on, most of us will look around to see what other people are doing, or we'll maybe go talk to an authority figure, or we'll just sort of sit with the uncertainty. But in both of these cases, you you seem to have this instinct to go to straight to some, the source texts. So
Right.
in the pizzeria case, you tell the story of your mom having this Jerusalem Bible under the glass case, So it
Right.
sounds like you combed through that thing in order to figure out, what should I do? And
Right.
then later in Costa Rica, and I know there were some things that led up to that, but when you really decided there's something going on here with the Pauline doctrine, as I recall, you really combed through the Reina Varela, and so
Reina Valera Bible.
Valera, you combed through the Reina Valera, yes. So, uh, I guess my question to you is, well, where did this come from? And was there something in your early life that made you have confidence in your ability to analyze texts? Have you ever thought about that impulse or that decision that you've made to go straight to text analysis?
Okay. Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, it reflects, I think, your sociological nature. You want to know why would someone culturally do this? And I think in our world, we didn't have the internet when I was a kid, but we had books. We still read books back then, physically. And when I was a young boy, I basically all we had was an encyclopedia that my mom and dad got from Grand Union store once a month by paying, $10 for it. So we had this encyclopedia that grew eventually, and I could look up stuff. And so I got used to looking up stuff in the encyclopedia. That's all we had. It's like the only book we had, other than the encased in stone Jerusalem Bible. And but eventually, as I went to prep school, I got used to the idea that my prep school was basically it was a Jesuit institution, which was a college level education for people who could qualify. So I scored high on the SAT. I get in there, skip eighth grade, go there. That's when I really learned that anything you want is in this library. So now I had this access to the Fordham Prep Library. I'm like, wow, this is fantastic. So I started to use that to just research all kinds of things that I was curious about, science in particular at the time, and then Greek and Latin. It was fun. And so I just learned that, books are a way to access truth or facts. And so that was such a revelation as a child that, my gosh, you can verify or not verify. The thing I also learned somewhat early on is that people make mistakes even in text that you're reading. And there could be differences of opinion. And I think a lot of us don't experience that and then realize, hey, you can have two different scholars who don't agree about something, or for example, in biblical studies, an earlier text can trump a later text because the earlier always is presumably more valid because it didn't get corrupted by later copying. So all these ideas uh, are foreign to a lot of people that you can actually have mistakes by scholars. Oh, no scholar are all true. Well, I learned early on, no, you can have different scholars or have different points of view. And that also bled into my legal career because I learned, okay, you can have the top expert where you're paying tens of thousands of dollars per minute for this person, and the other guys are getting paid tens of thousands of dollars to say the exact opposite. And you wonder, how do these two people say two opposite things? And then you learn there's something called what I call shades of meaning analysis. And so a lot of these experts actually are saying the same thing, but because they're being paid by one party or the other, they want to skew it, and so they're just using just shades of meaning different so that they sound like they're saying something opposite to the other person. And and you just have to realize it's actually a good system we have where, truth, is iron sharpening iron. And so when you put the two together, you can actually oftentimes get truth. So I also learned that in my legal career. So I guess overall, I just started to get reliant on don't make any snap judgment about anything you think is true or not true. Go test your belief system by researching. And so researching is, I think, the key to finding truth. And so the truth shall set you free. So, uh, and then I just always loved the words of Jesus just as a kid. This is in my Catholic upbringing is, we only heard a few things of what he said in Catholicism. You don't ever read any of the Bible, by the way, in grammar school, but you do get to see the Our Father and the Sermon on the Mount I remember being read, and there were homilies occasionally where they would read it once we switched from Latin to English. I don't know if you knew that back in the 60s. I think it was until 67. I'm going to church since I was 6 years old, so that would have been like 64. So sorry, we're literally listening to Latin every week, right? And that's why I wanted to study Latin in high school, right? But in that minor era where I was in my age 6 to 9, I didn't know what was going on. But when I could finally hear the words of Jesus, I thought, wow, he's really brilliant. He's really great. The Sermon on the Mount. So they did read it to us finally in English. So I think around age 9, 10, I was intrigued by the words of Jesus for the first time. You got to hear it, and so that's the other thing is when I grew up is the words I heard in church were only in Latin, completely, 100%. And so a lot of Catholic people today don't have any concept of that anymore. So you go to church, you don't understand anything that's being said to you, not one word. And but you also had the missal that you would read it in Latin. And so you learned how to read Latin, but you didn't know what it was saying, you know. So but that's why when you heard it finally in English, you really wanted to know more about Jesus because boy, that this person says, blessed are the meek, blessed are the whatever. So all of these things were new, and so I think um, a lot of kids today don't appreciate the greatness of having the internet, the access to all of this information at your fingertips, and you can even get a translation of Latin if you were actually being taught in Latin. So it was just like um, but for me, that opening of the world was very small, but was so exciting. And nowadays, the kids just take it for granted. They don't realize what a totally different and wonderful world they live in. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point. So going from the point where you began to investigate more diligently with the Reina
Valera.
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 There's a very famous Chilean biologist named Francisco Varela, and
Oh, really?
I just love him. So
So you
that's
get
my
the
that's my excuse for continuing to say that.
okay. I hope I'm even saying it. Reina Valera is actually
Yeah,
the
yeah,
RV is
yeah.
the symbol for it, just so anyone wants to look
Okay.
it up.
Well,
Yeah.
good. I'm just going to call it RV.
The
So
RV.
right, the RV. So how gradual was your shift in perspective? So I think you became a Christian around age 14 or 15, and then as I can kind of piece together in your 40s was when you came back from Costa Rica and began to investigate more carefully this seeming discrepancy between Paul and Jesus' words. So, could you tell us something about was that a long process? What was that? How long did it take you to reach the conclusion that there was even indeed a contradiction, never mind some of the later conclusions that you've drawn?
All right. Well, basically, in Costa Rica, things happened that I still didn't fully want to understand. I was still a totally Pauline Christian. I'd been teaching Bible class into the high school class and sometimes the adult class at a church in California for over 10 years. And then in a 200 member church, I was just one person. So, but I came from this perspective and I really wouldn't let go of it no matter what, as far as I could tell, even in Costa Rica, when I'm hearing a friend of mine, he's being kicked out as the church pastor. He just come down with his family and 3 kids and wife. And the first sermon he gives is on faith alone, and they throw him out. They said, well, we wanted you to preach the Bible. You're preaching something that James says is wrong. Now, I didn't realize it was James was the issue. So at first I didn't know why they were kicking him out. But I went to my neighborhood church in where I lived in Gracia, and yeah, that pastor says, "What? Don't you believe in Santiago?" And I go, "Santiago, Santiago. Oh yeah, that's Saint James, Saint Iago. Okay, yeah. What about him? Yeah, he's in the Bible too." He says, "Well, I said, yeah, I guess he is. You read that guy?" That's kind of how I responded to him. So always had the perspective that there's something off on James probably, so I'm not going to put any weight on him compared to Paul. Paul's so much more wonderful, and he's somebody we all recognize, is important. So this is in my face, and I'm translating. Then I was trying to test out why the Costa Ricans seeing things differently, and so I started translating and trying to understand if the Reina Valera was corrupt and they were mistaken. But I found out actually by using my Greek knowledge is, they actually had a superior translation, and so I would actually say the best translation you could ever read is the Reina Valera of all places. And but anyway, so when I came to the United States, I still was not willing to consider there was a problem with Paul, and I decided, one way to test Paul a little bit is I'm going to do a study on whether I can cite Paul in support of what I believe is Jesus' doctrine that eternal security is not applicable to Christians. It's not true. And this is, there's a variety of reasons why Christians think Jesus teaches eternal security, because some things have been translated so you can't see the underlying Greek structure sentences. But like, for example, Jesus says, those who keep on following me and keep on obeying me should not perish. And that's another thing. That's in John 10, I think it is. So you've got clearly, if you don't tell the people the structure, the continuous present participle structure of keep on, you make it sound like it's automatic. If you believe in me, if you follow me, like it's 1 second is how it reads in English. But in Greek, it's if you keep on following me, if you keep on listening to me, you should not perish and you should not be snatched from my hand. It's actually what he says. You should not be. It's a subjunctive tense in Greek. It's not told you that in English, and so you're blind. If you read the Reina Valera, you can see it. Because, by the way, Spanish has the same subjunctive and clear definition of terms or tenses. So you know when it's a subjunctive, when you know when it's a present participle, and so on. So anyway, so I come back. I'm totally just trying to deal with the testing Paul a little bit by examining the doctrine he teaches on salvation. Is it guaranteed? Jesus clearly says it's subjunctive. It's a conditional tense. It's not something you absolutely are guaranteed if you believe for a second or follow him for a second. You have to keep on doing these things and so on. So that's where I simply kept trying, and I wrote a whole book, 600-page book, which will never see the light of day, where I get bogged down and I'm doing my Greek translation of Paul, and I can't not make him match. Okay, so he says you have a salvation is guaranteed or sealed for you in heaven. So it's like you are in heaven already, and that's and that's why you can defend eternal security if you researched it and you go, okay, but why does Jesus say the opposite? And that is clear cut. If you know Greek, particularly if you know the subjunctive tense, if you know those passages I'm talking to you about, you would go, okay, so these two don't match. Well, what explains that? So how can they be both in the Bible? And so you start having a quandary, or what I call internal dissonance. You got to reconcile it. And how do you reconcile this? So so there was a little bit of the internet when this happened. So this is 2005. I've written that book. Um, um, and I just basically turned to my wife and I said, honey, I'm having trouble making Paul and Jesus reconcile. I'm doing my translation work on that. What do you think? And she says, I've never really liked that guy. I'm like, oh, really? Thanks for telling me now. We got married in a church. You didn't really like Paul, and I've been talking about Paul and preaching his gospel. Now you tell me you don't like him. But I didn't get angry at her because I thought she was really ahead of me spiritually. She instinctively knew something was wrong with him, but she kept quiet, being the good submissive wife that she wanted to be. But really secretly down deep she didn't like the guy. So anyway, so that is really I came kicking and screaming. There's no way you can deny that. I was just totally going to do everything I could to defend Paul until I couldn't. And that's why, and that's the way I don't tell people you should give in to what I'm saying right away. Go test it. Go test what I'm saying. Go look it up yourself. Get educated, because your entire future, if you believe your salvation could be dependent upon God, and you want to follow what you think is His words, then you should test all these things out and make sure you're listening to the right voice. what really became surprising to me, and I think the first thing I noticed after I started questioning Paul, because we were still going to church regularly, is I started to take a log. And I did this for 5 years. So while I'm going through my transformation, I actually just wanted to take the heartbeat of these pastors. Are they aware that they should be preaching Jesus more maybe than Paul, or at least mix them up so you get the 2 points of view at least while you're at church? The answer was a resounding no, Doug. So I kept the tally pad. Do you remember tally marks where you do 4 little lines and then you cross it? That's a
Sure,
tally
yeah,
mark system. Yeah.
absolutely.
All right. So I did the tally mark system for 5 years, and that really convinced me something's wrong because the measurement was um incredible. 13 times Paul would be quoted in full for every one time Jesus would be quoted. And it wouldn't matter if I went to a Presbyterian church or a Baptist church or not an evangelical church or whatever it was. And the weird thing is, even when was the subject of the matter, I remember a pastor was teaching us Luke that day. And, it's like 10 verses. So he would quote Jesus's words. And then suddenly he all disappears. It's like an hour of just telling us what Paul says. And I'm like, and even though it was a passage, Paul still overwhelmed Jesus, and there was nothing left of what he had said that you could hear the words of Jesus from this passage of Luke. So that's when I really said, there's something wrong, something spiritually off cue. And that's when I didn't even know what dispensationalism was. So I said, if I had AI now, I would say, is there a doctrine that says we are free to ignore Jesus? That would be what I would do today, because there actually is a doctrine called dispensationalism that says you can. And this started predominantly with Rudolf Bultmann, a German, in 1929, and he wrote or he argued against a movement in his country called the Back to Jesus movement. So literally, there was a scholar who wrote a book, and he was not anti-Paul. He just simply mentioned, as a matter of fact, and it shocked all the German people, was Paul. He said Paul never quotes Jesus, and most of us think, well, of course Paul is quoting Jesus. He doesn't quote Jesus once, not once, telling you or I a message. He does quote the communion liturgy, but anybody could know that. He quotes Jesus once talking to himself, saying, "I'm not going to release you from an angel of Satan because in your weakness is my strength." That's it. That's all he's ever quoted to Jesus. Everything else, he never quotes Jesus in any of his epistles, and not even in a paraphrase, not even in vision or whatever. And 2 Corinthians 12, verses 4 to 6, he explains why. He says his words are incomprehensible when I'm in the third heaven. Incomprehensible means he doesn't even understand them himself. And then he says it's illegal, it's illicit. This is amazing. Illicit, illegal to tell you what he said. So this is his excuse. Very strange. So when I started boiling it down, I'm going, um, this Back to Jesus movement sounds to me like these people had the right idea, but Bullman stepped in, and this is what really bothered me. Is he says Paul says in 2 Corinthians 3, I think it's chapter 5, verse 13, if I got it right. He says, "We once knew Jesus in the flesh, but we now know him that way no longer." And Bowman read that to mean we knew Jesus when he preached the Sermon on the Mount and all those things. That's in the flesh. But now that Paul has met him in the third heaven, we only know him through Paul. But I thought to myself, Bowman, that is not answering what this Back to Jesus movement was saying. Is the scholar who brought that out just indirectly didn't intend to, but he made people realize, why are we following Paul? Because he doesn't quote Jesus. So Bowman really didn't answer the question. Paul doesn't even quote Jesus. How can you say that we now know him through Paul's revelations when Paul doesn't tell us anything he says? So it doesn't make any sense. So that's when I said to myself, this dispensational argument doesn't work. So the bottom line is, these were the Paulinism started to crumble in my hands. I couldn't hold it together with anything. It was, it seems to me like it's scotch tape, band-aids. And I really felt the honest feeling. You get the feeling. Now, I hope if you're a Pauline Christian, you don't get offended listening to this. I began to think this is the message of Antichrist. You are not just you're not Christian anymore. but you're also opposed to listening to Jesus. It's not even like you have an open door to hear his words anymore. He's gone. He's dead. Bowman even says, and this is the most evil, perverse thing I've ever heard, but he says this, and this is in a Erzman's publication, as if it's a good thing. And it says, Boltman said this, um, the whatever Jesus thought, whatever was on his heart, I don't want to know. I do not know about it, and I don't want to know about it. That's what he, this is part of his defense of why 2 Corinthians applies, and he doesn't need to follow Jesus. I don't care what was in the heart of Jesus at all. That's what he says. It's one of my videos. It's a direct quote. And it's in an Erzman's publication as if this is something good. And I'm thinking to myself, this is disgusting. This is like evil. So there is some spirit of Antichrist in this. And I could get into that argument or issue. There's so many issues with Paul, but just as a Christian, you have to respond and say to yourself, why are we going to church and they don't preach Jesus? So I can guarantee you that if you go to a church in this country, I've tested them all. I haven't gone to every state though, so maybe you have a unique congregation, or maybe. By the way, there is a streak of Christianity that did not get infected. It's not a large group, but it's the Anabaptists, Quakers, some of the Methodists. So I want to show you there are some fringe groups, even Church of Christ, even though some of them are very Pauline. But these groups kind of were on the edge away from that because they came out of, in the Reformation, there was a counter group that were adamantly didn't want to have anything to do with Paul, and it's called the Anabaptists. They officially didn't want to have anything to do with Paul. And Karlstadt was their inspiration. So another thing people don't know is in the Reformation, the two founders, Martin Luther was one, and Karlstadt was his superior and his mentor. And the two of them were the ones who first were leading the Protestant Reformation. And Karlstadt then in 1520 wrote a book on the canon of the scripture. And in there, it's pretty radical. He took all of Paul's epistles and he removed them from a level equal with Jesus and he put them way down here and he put Jesus way over here. And he said the words of Jesus alone are the inspired words of Scripture, which, by the way, modern Protestant canon scholarship agrees. Bruce Metzger agrees that the early church always thought only Jesus's words were on par with the law and the prophets, and anything that was in a letter or a writing like that was just never considered the same degree. And so Karlstadt actually was way ahead of his time. Metzger, of course, his opinion, even though it's considered what you have to be taught in divinity school or theology school, it doesn't matter anymore. Paul's won out, so even Metzger can't break through. Okay, so just so you know, I'm not sitting here alone. There are the top canon scholar of the world today. It's never been changed. 1994 book on the canon of the New Testament, and if you read it, he's just blunt, and he tells you the words of Peter about Paul being scripture is not what it says, and it does not change the fact that nobody thought anybody was on par with Jesus, even Paul. So, but back to the Reformation, that's what happened with Karlstadt and Luther is they split on Paul, and because of that, denominations that were reading the book Canon of Scripture by Karlstadt, they ended up being non-Pauline, and that's the Anabaptists first, and there were other sects that followed. And there was, I don't want to say the Quakers were directly heirs because Quakers are here and came from the United States, but that group, and I think it was the Mennonites, was also non-Pauline for a while, at least the period I was studying. So basically, there's a lot of overwhelming evidence to me that there is an anti-Christian spirit in this dispensational argument. It doesn't mean if you believe in Paul, you're following the Antichrist himself. But let me add one thing about Paul. John defines the Antichrist as anyone who tells you Jesus did not come in human flesh. Guess who says that in the New Testament? Twice. He says in the book of Philippians chapter 2, he says Jesus only appeared to be a man. That was the first time he says it. Then in the second sentence, he makes a statement twice. Jesus only looked like a man, but he wasn't really a man. He appeared to have human flesh, but he really didn't have human flesh. You got to read this stuff and go to yourself, John appears to be talking about Paul. Who else says this in the New Testament? And then you have to say to yourself, well, why is it important that Jesus came in human flesh? Well, that means he shared our identity. He's human. And Jesus says he's the Son of Man 81 times. It means in Greek and in the Hebrew original, it means human being. He was emphasizing, I'm a human being just like you. But the Father dwells in me, he says. And that's a very different and unique relationship that you and I are not going to have. The Father, we may have the Holy Spirit, but the Holy Spirit is an emanation from God. But the Father to dwell in you is a big deal. So there's a difference. But anyway, so anyway, it it was a gradual thing back when I was studying for 5 years or 4 years. We got back in 2004. So in those next few years, I started writing the book Jesus Words Only, and I finished it in 2005 and six, a draft, and then I think that's about when it was finished. So yeah, all these things just forced me to research and then find out what's really going on here and what is my obligation as a Christian, as a follower of Christ? What do I have to do? And that's the other thing. You have to stop asking yourself, what is my friends, my neighbors, my family, my mom, my dad, my brother? You got to stop asking those questions. You got to say, when I die, I'm going to all be alone. Probably everyone's going to be dead by then. I got to make this decision for myself and help others if I'm wrong. I mean, there's a lot of people who are wrong about this, what they're following, who they're listening to. And so that's kind of basically how it all arose.
Thanks for that insight. Note to self, because I definitely would like to maybe do an entirely different video, specifically talking more about that Antichrist spirit running through things, for sure. But just to recap, so I want to make sure that I'm clear. You wrote a 600-page book that will not be published in your attempts to defend Paul.
Well, to reconcile Paul into
To
this,
reconcile.
at least the idea that faith. Let me say this: if Jesus taught eternal security, then Jesus would be saying it depends what that made you secure about. So let's say it was faith, then Jesus would be the same as Paul. Okay, so but Jesus doesn't teach eternal security. He teaches this insecurity. Basically, you should be if you obey my words. You should if you listen to me. Blah blah blah. So that was to me, if I could figure this one out, because this is where you don't get into, a lot of theological problems. It is or isn't eternal security or not. And if Paul could agree with Jesus, then I would have no problem. But I can't make Paul agree with Jesus. He does teach eternal security too clearly in many passages, so that I can't put them together. So that book stayed on the shelf, and I basically and it's still in my computers. I actually have a video where I show people what that book looked like and all this work I put into it. I mean, I have hundreds of pages of, trying to pull them together, and I have a whole chapter where I thought Paul would agree. I will tell you, there is one amazing passage of Paul where he seems to not agree, and that's in 1 Corinthians 14. A lot of people don't ever read it. Paul says, I know of nothing I've done anything wrong. Of course, he never knows he's done anything wrong. I know of nothing that I've done wrong. But even so, I'm not confident, in essence, is what he's saying. I'm not confident that I will be going to heaven or something like that. So in relation to that, I therefore burden my body, or I don't want to say abuse my body, but he basically says that he restricts himself so he should not fall. So I'm thinking, well, that sounds pretty good, right? That sounds like he believes he's not eternally secure. But maybe he means he's the only one because he's telling all of us we're all secure. You've got a seal of the Holy Spirit in heaven. That's Ephesians chapter 4. So, and also First Corinthians is one of his earlier works. So maybe he had a later meeting with Jesus in the third heaven, and maybe that's where Jesus told him, no, 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 you had it wrong. You don't have to worry about your salvation. You just have a seal of the Holy Spirit in heaven. It will guarantee your salvation. Okay, so you got to also look at the progression of his writings. It could be that he thought he was insecure at one point and then later realized that doctrine's false and he taught something different. So anyway, but there is one passage I found of Paul that is not in agreement with eternal security, and that was it, 1 Corinthians 14.
Interesting. But clearly you put an enormous amount of effort into trying to reconcile uh, Paul with Jesus' words.
Yes.
I think that's important to note for anybody who might, stumble across your work and think that you just have an agenda, that you've been pursuing all this time. It's interesting.
No,
For the
no, it would
record,
have been a
may it be
lot
noted.
easier. Yeah, I'd have a lot more friends and a lot more family, less friction with family and friends if I just went along with the crowd. But uh, and what's so interesting is a lot of other people have taken this path way before Doug, and Ernest Renan, Tolstoy, Karlstadt himself in the Reformation. And the other thing
Bentham.
is, the next book I wrote was Jesus' Words on Salvation, and the first chapter was I decided to go into depth on. Now this book came from 2014, I think it was. So I wrote that in 2014, and that's where I in depth went into the Reformation. I found out that Luther himself repented of faith alone. Luther repented of Paul entirely. Paul had taught, he said earlier, Paul teaches us the law is dead and gone. And now in the antinomian theses, he says, anyone who teaches you that the law is dead and gone is like a parrot, is just repeating something without any understanding. It's like a parent who says, how are you? It doesn't know what it's saying. And that, I mean, he not only insulted Paul, he called him what he has to be. He has to be an apostate if you claim these things, that God's law is dead and gone completely. So no, there's no doubt that Luther changed. And a funny thing is, a Professor Sontag, who's a very famous professor, and even published the Antinomian Theses. He was trying to challenge me. Well, this doesn't mean he rejected Paul. And I said, well, and then I showed him the passages. It's almost like he translated a book from whatever, and he didn't even absorb what it meant and didn't put it in historical context. And so we went back a couple times, and he said, I will get back to you. I'm going to keep researching this. And I never heard from him again. After 3 communications, it's as if he realized I was right, and he had done all this work, and he didn't even read. He didn't absorb what it meant. He just translated the words on the page, but he didn't even factor it in. What it means, that this is what else could Luther mean when he's saying, if you if you teach the law's been dead and gone, it's like you're a parrot who just says, "Hello, how are you?" It speaks, but it does not understand what it's saying. Do you, that's the current Lutheran translation. So but he has also another translation. I just bought that book recently, by the way. I'm going to double check that is there somehow he translated differently. I'm going to double check.
So
But
you
that's how
touched on,
crazy the world is. Go ahead.
yeah, you touched on something briefly that I did want to ask you about. So looking back on these years, or since you've been working on this topic, how has your life changed? I mean, I guess my question is, how has your life changed as a follower of Jesus, not Paul? And even maybe you can think about it on an everyday mundane basis, or maybe just your priorities, or your sense of the world. Maybe I'm being too nosy, but
No, no, no.
what does
Well,
it look like
okay.
in practice to follow Jesus, not Paul, I guess.
Okay. Well, the last thing I would have ever expected, which is my orientation towards God changed. In other words, the Father now becomes much more in focus. The Father who Jesus told us to pray to. I don't remember when I switched praying, but I was always praying to Jesus. Jesus, help me this. Jesus, help me that. Because that's kind of what you're taught in Catholic school, or at least that's what you think you're supposed to be doing. But Jesus didn't teach us to do that, did he? He said, pray to the Father. He didn't say, pray to me. Now, he said, you can ask for things in my name and I will advocate for you, but doesn't mean you should pray to him directly. And so that is a fundamentally big difference. And then the biggest thing that caused me to change was when I had to decide, am I going to believe in the Trinity given what I'm learning? And so, that was also, I would say, the hardest thing to give up, because but there's a verse in John 17:1-3, where Jesus, he is praying to the Father, and he calls the Father the only true God. The Father is the only true God. If you're a Catholic boy, wait a minute, there's a God, the Son, the God, the Holy Spirit, and they're all three as one. And oh my gosh. But Jesus says there's only one true God. I can't take this anymore. What more do I have to deal with? So that became the next step is I was now open to listen to the words of Jesus about whether the Father is the only true God or is there more gods that have to be considered, put in a Godhead and worshipped as God. So anyway, so that was the that's a big difference. Fundamental change of orientation is that now God is the Father, Jesus is the Son, as he claims, as he says he is, and that he is your advocate and he's also your teacher, he's your sole rabbi, and so on. So the orientation to Jesus is out of love and respect for my king, and that's who God made him. He made us our king. He's also the prophet of Deuteronomy 18. So a lot of reorientation was now possible, which I think when you're a Pauline Christian, you can't even imagine that you're now going to worship God the Father. You know, aren't we like so far away from him? Like Jesus taught us to worship himself. That's actually what most Pauline Christians think. And I have to say, I kind of fell into the same camp for a long period of time. So all of these things open up to your mind is that now you have a better you're more open to listen to Jesus. And now finally Jesus' words do penetrate you and by studying Paul's words, why they don't penetrate me anymore, and getting them out of my system, which believe me is very hard to do. It's very hard. It's so ingrained in your brain, you can't almost think without Paul in your head. You know, I remember Paul teaches us that Jesus was the prototokos, the firstborn of creation, and then Jesus created all things, and nothing was created that Jesus didn't create. I mean, that is such a big deal, and that's in the Nicene Creed, right? If you pay attention. And I had no idea, you know, initially when I rejected Paul, that I have to now reevaluate that statement, right? So, is there any creator other than Yahweh the Father? Well, Isaiah 44 says the Father Yahweh says, "I'm the only one. There was no one with me helping me creating the heavens and earth." Oh boy, we got a problem here. Um, and Paul is actually attributing it to Jesus to be the creator. Now, I mean, if you watch my recent videos, this Paul's view is what's called the Zeus Apollo religion, and it's a whole other thing I didn't realize until just the past year. But that was a big change. So a lot of things happen when you are no longer listening to Paul. You'll listen to Jesus, and he'll penetrate you for the first time. And you go, okay. And there's a lot of other things that he's cleaned up my life. My idea of using atonement, like I mean, I don't know if you know ever thought about this. Is like if you stole something, right? Theoretically, if you were a Pauline Christian, you don't have to give it back. I just have to say I'm sorry and plead the blood of Christ. I mean, really? Is there anything that you have to do? No, you don't have to. That's all you have to do. And I always laugh to myself uh, about my story about the pizzeria thing, where I got this money I wasn't supposed to get by the change girl. She gives me too much change, and I felt so guilty about it. And I researched it, I researched the Bible. This is at age 14. This is when I had a conversion to Christ that had nothing to do with the church or Protestantism. And I basically, you know, studied and I decided, okay, I have to give it back. And now in hindsight, I sometimes laugh and I say, well, hey, gosh, when I was a Protestant Pauline Christian, hey, I didn't have to do any of that. I didn't have to get the change back. What a bummer if I'd only known. Because I'm clean, I'm washed free. No repentance necessary. This is the best world ever. So that was but when I realized that, it's like you have to make amends for things that you have uh hurt someone over. You have to take whatever steps you need to rectify those things. So all of that is but you know, again, Pauline Christianity will say you're trying to earn your salvation. I'm saying, well, you know what? Making amends is not the same thing as working for my salvation. It's making amends for the harm or injury I've caused God or man or woman. And so that's a different world. So this is how I live. I live thinking, well, if I do something wrong, I'm gonna have to pay for it. So maybe I shouldn't do something wrong. You see what happens? You think differently when you're Pauline. You don't have to think about whether you did anything wrong or right. You just have to pray about it, and it's gone. It's gone. I plead the blood of Christ that covers it. I can do anything I want. And we don't realize Jude when he said there's somebody who teaches grace. It's a license for sin, and he's obviously even Augustine and Renan both said he must be talking about Paul. It unfortunately is the consequence of Pauline theology that dominates today, that there is no real necessity to repent, therefore, and do amends. Um, and so the amendment in fixing things is no longer a requirement. You just have to plead the blood of Christ. Anything else than that, you're trying to earn your salvation. And so they smear everything Jesus ever taught as a foolishness almost. But so that's what's changed. I live a life where I think I try to do what's right, and if I did something wrong, I try to fix it. Maybe that's the best way of putting it, which never would have crossed my mind in the past. No, I did something wrong. I just say I'm sorry to myself. Say sorry to God and move on. Just don't worry about it. God will take care of them. The atonement takes care of their pain and suffering that I've caused. And that's a big difference to take responsibility for your actions and rectify them. And wouldn't the world be a better place if we followed Jesus's way of living than Paul's way of living, which is a non-consequential, do whatever I want, pay, let Jesus pay the price, the perfect price, and I just smear any effort to try to tell myself I don't have to do it, because to do that I'm trying to earn my salvation. Yeah. So that's a life I will never lead again. That's a wrong way of thinking. That's not Jesus's thinking.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So what has been one of the most interesting things that you've discovered while you've been researching? This could have nothing to do with Paul, and it could be something that's very small, or it could be monumental. Just maybe some facts that you've come across, or what has been most surprising or fascinating to you?
All right. Well, the number one discovery I made was that Bishop Ambrose in 350 AD wrote a commentary on the book of Corinthians in Latin. Wasn't translated till 1999, but mistranslated, or I should say, deliberately omitting something. But it said enough that I went and researched it. I pulled it up. And the 6 words the guy didn't, the Bray edition. Now, he's not the translator, he's the editor, and he has a translation team. So someone in that translation team, an unnamed person, did not translate the whole passage. And what the whole passage says, Ambrose says, Paul's words in 1 Corinthians 9, verse 2 is, to some I'm not an apostle, but to you, Corinthians, I am an apostle, because you've seen the marks of an apostle, the signs and wonders that I've done. Okay? So Ambrose makes a comment on that. And he says that Paul, this is a reference by Ambrose. Ambrose is saying this is a reference by Paul about the fact that the 12 determined him to be a false apostle because of his views on circumcision and Sabbath. Like, wow. And it goes on, and it says, and this led to a dispute between them, and they decided to separate. And then what triggered in my mind, since this only happened a year ago, is Paul in Galatians chapter 2. If you pay close attention, Paul says in Galatians that the 12 and him, he said, they gave me the right hand of fellowship. Now, this is his perspective, but they were saying goodbye to each other. And they're going their way, and I'm supposed to go my way, and I'm to go to the Gentiles, and they're to go only to the Jews. Now, I always thought to myself, why would Jesus tell the 12, you got to go to the Gentiles and the Jews? And Paul's saying that they've given that up to him to go to the Gentiles. So it's, you have to believe Paul sometimes, trust that he's telling you the truth. But that doesn't make sense, right? But what does make sense is what Ambrose said. And then finally, the piece came together in my mind. Okay, now I get the other side of the story. And it turns out Eusebius mentions this too, but he doesn't tell you who the Ebion are. So the Ebion was the name of the early church. There's really no dispute about that. Many scholars all point out its earliest name was the Ebion. And the earliest Christians were called Ebionites, not whatever. So later in time, when the Trinity doctrine got adopted, they became deemed heretical. Okay, the Ebion. So of course, they didn't believe that Jesus created the heavens and earth because they believed Yahweh did. So now, as I do, because that's what the Bible actually says, and I don't believe Paul's words are correct. So, but anyway, that's the. I kind of lost my train of thought on that. where was I
One of
going?
the most interesting.
Oh yeah, yeah. So
Things. Yeah.
Ambrose, Ambrose. There you go. So
Mhm.
Ambrose is the number one. There's another one that's very interesting, and uh, but the Ambrose one is important because um, this was hidden away. It was in a book called, how I found it initially was, it was called The Writings of St. Paul by Mr. Meeks, and he's a professor, Yale professor, and I think he's Yale. And he just took a little blurb out of it, and it had just said enough that I was suspicious of what it could contain, and he didn't quote it all. And then even the passage I went to and I found his link, the Bray edition of the translation of the book of the commentary on First Corinthians by Ambrose. But then it was clear that the effort, the deliberateness of removing 6 key words in translation really bothers me. So, uh, and I thought there's a lot of messages for Christians today. Is there was a truth well known in the early church that what the other side of the coin of Galatians was the 12 determined Paul a false apostle. It's also implicitly already in Revelation chapter 2 verse 2. Jesus says he complimented the Ephesians for rejecting one who said those who said they were apostles but are not, but are false and are liars. Okay. And then if you keep reading, Jesus mocks those who calls themselves, or Jesus calls them Nicolaitans, which is a Aramaic term. A lot of people didn't know that until more recently, which means those who say, "Let us eat whatever we want." Nicholas is Aramaic for "let us eat," and then Nicolaitans is a Greek way of saying people who say that. So people who say, "Let us eat." So Jesus was mocking these people, saying, "Whatever we can eat, we want to eat," and then he goes on to condemn or commend the Ephesians for not eating meat sacrificed to idols as taught by these false apostles. And then he excoriates 2 churches for eating meat sacrificed to idols as endorsed by these bad people. And guess who teaches it's okay to eat meat sacrificed to idols? Well, Paul teaches it's okay in 1 Corinthians 8 and 1 Corinthians 10 because we know an idol is nothing. Yeah, but what about the blessings on by the pagan priests on the food in the first place? And so it gets sold in the meat market. Don't buy that. Jewish people would never eat that. Daniel wouldn't eat the meat on the table, even though he wasn't partaking in the sacrifice. It was delivered to his food, his table. He said, "King, I don't want to eat here, Nebuchadnezzar. I want to go in my room and eat vegetables." And that's what Nebuchadnezzar let him do. So you just don't eat this stuff. So that's what Paul was allowing and what Jesus was condemning in Revelation 2:2 and the rest of Revelation. But the bottom line is this is all back to Ambrose, getting back to Ambrose's. Now it all makes sense that this idea of Jesus being calling Paul a false apostle right there matches up with Ambrose, matches up with Eusebius, who says the Ebionites did Paul to be a false apostle because of his views on the law. Okay, so you've got all this evidence now corroborating itself, and now the picture is emerging that it was undisputedly known what had happened between Paul and them, and Paul's version of Galatians is the only one you see. And even there, you can read it and you don't realize it's a complete schism. He is saying we schismed, but he made it sound like they had said something that they gave us the right hand of fellowship. And what's so interesting is he actually doesn't attribute any words to it. He says they gave us the right hand of fellowship, which all that means is they shook hands, and we departed from each other. But he makes it sound like they were endorsing him, when obviously that's just his spin. But he doesn't even dare to put any words in their mouth. See? So now you've got this proof that Paul admits to the schism. We know when it happened. It was 57 AD approximately. It was after likely some other events, but that's a different question. How does this fit in a timeline exactly? But anyway, that was a big deal. To me, Ambrose is the number one discovery I found. And by the way, nobody's touched it. Nobody. But it's been out there for over a year and a half, meaning no Pauline defender has tried to come and bring it up, because their strategy is don't even give it any mention, because if we're silent, maybe his videos will disappear or something. So this is the only strategy they have left. They will not debate me. So if anyone wants to debate me on that, please let me know. I'll debate you what it says. The other one that was a big discovery was in it's a passage where Jesus has asked him, Matthew 19 verse 17. He says, "Oh, good teacher, what good thing must I do?" Remember that? Okay. Well, this is a very interesting passage when you read the original version of it, and I'll show you what that is in a second. But the way it reads now is, "Why do you ask me about the good? For there's none good but one." Now, that's the NIV version. Do you know how many words have been removed to make it sound like that way? What it actually said is, "Why do you call me good? For there's none good but the Father, the creator of heaven and earth." 6 times. I found that by accident in 6 different places. The word Father was there 6 times. There was none good but one, the Father. And then a couple passages versions have the creator of heaven and earth. So obviously somebody went through and not only changed Matthew, but they had to change Luke and Mark. And the man actually had come up to Jesus, and this is still present in the Mark passage where the man comes up to him and kneels before Jesus. And obviously, kneeling can be one of two meanings. It means I'm worshiping you as God, or I'm showing homage to you as a king. So Jesus' response is obviously thinking that this man thought Jesus was God somehow. So Jesus is saying, "Why do you call me good? For there's none good but one, the Father." You don't call me the Son good. He's the good one. I'm not the good one. Don't worship me like I'm him. There's one who's good, the Father, the creator of heavens and earth. And that other thing about creator of heavens and earth was definitely in conflict with the Nicene Creed. So a lot of things changed when the Nicene Creed was adopted. It then had to go back and rewrite passages and completely rewrite them in sync. And so this had to be removed from Mark, Luke, and Matthew. Very tough job. And now, interestingly, the original passage in Luke was quoted in, and how we know it was from Luke was because Tertullian quotes it in, he says he's quoting Luke. And so, you've got a real problem here. Now you've got somebody's telling you it's in this other passage, and it's not just in Matthew. And clearly, most of the other quotes were from Matthew. And anyway, so that I think is the second biggest passage I found, and that just shows you that's not a Pauline issue, but that's a Trinity issue of how desperate they are to hide the fact of who is the true creator of heavens and earth, who is the true God that you can worship, and that Jesus would reject modern worship of directly to himself, as I was taught as a child to do, is pray to Jesus. Don't pray to God the Father. He's too busy. Just pray to Jesus. He's got your back. So those are my two milestones, I would say. I have others, but they're not as significant.
Excellent. Okay. What does Paul write, even if it's plagiarism of some kind, that you really like?
Oh, that I really like? Oh, well, I have to say almost all his sayings that come out of Platonism and Hellenism are really kind of nice stuff. Love is kind, love is beautiful. Uh, these are things that if you like Greek poetry and Greek writings and Greek philosophy, he resonates with you, and that's because I love all those things. I enjoy reading Greek and Latin stuff, and he definitely hits the mark on those scores. Yeah.
So you're not saying that every single thing that he says or writes is terrible or trash or not compelling in some way,
No,
right?
and that's why it's so it's so attractive. Uh, that's another thing is Satan comes as an angel of light. Paul, guess who said those words? Paul. Wonderful. I love that saying. But a lot of things he says always backfires because it's like, what you come to me as an angel of light, but yet you don't have any quotes of Jesus. So eventually he gives me a lot of wonderful sayings and wonderful things, but and turns of phrases, but I can recognize where they come from too. So that's the other thing. Now I use my Latin reading or my spare time when I'm just reading old Greek texts or whatever it is. I can see where Paul is just ripping off, very well done ancient pieces. he even puts in Jesus' mouth in on the road to Damascus, the part of the play from the book, the play Euripides. You cannot kick against the pricks. And Paul puts it in the meter or the rhyme of Greek. Greek has either a regular way of ending the words, and it would not be meter, or it can be a meter, so it rhymes. And Paul is quoting it from the play. He puts in Jesus' mouth the words from the play.
Just want to interject. What I'm talking about is if you look at Acts 9 and also in Acts 26, verse 14, Paul's Jesus on the road to Damascus comes down and tells Paul, Paul says, I heard a voice speaking to me and saying in the Hebrew tongue, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? It is hard for you to kick against the pricks. The words kick against the pricks are in meter, in actually the Greek here. Meter means a rhyme. So the way Paul's Jesus spoke to him, other than Hebrew, was these words, which in Greek were in meter. And that means it came right out of a play. So these plays in Greek theaters would have been done in a rhyme using meter. And that's exactly what I'm going to show you here in a play by Euripides called the Bacchae, written in 410 BC. He has an interchange with King Pentheus, and then basically Dionysius says, talking about himself in the third person, I would rather do him sacrifice than in a fury kick against the pricks. You a mortal, he a god. Meaning, don't mess with me. He's, by the way, a dying. He was born on December 25th. He's a dying god. His guts have been eaten out by animals, and he's dying. He became mortal. He became a human being from his deity position in heaven. He came down to earth. He was dying. He would later resurrect from the dead. And so this character that Paul is presenting to pagans through the book of Acts is something that's resonating with pagans, not you, because you don't know this play. But this would have been one of their great hero gods, because he's also known as Apollo in the cult of Delphi, according to Plutarch, the high priest to the priestess, Python priestess at Delphi in the 100 to 200 AD era, in that period of time. So this is not a small detail. This is a big deal that his Jesus was resonating with people who could understand the plays. And that's what King Festus and King Agrippa was the audience. And so was Festus, a judge. These would be elite people who would be able to go to plays. The plebeians didn't go to plays. And the Greek theater was, required you to have extra education as a Latin speaker to learn Greek. And therefore, there's the elite, the elite of the elite would have gone to Herod's theater at Jerusalem to listen to this play. This would have resonated to those kind of pagans. And that's exactly why Paul is quoting it here.
And by the way, that's a dying god, Dionysius, who's also known as Apollo. So he is depicting Jesus as Apollo for all those who are in on the know. So most of us Christians have no idea who he's quoting, what play he's quoting. And that's another thing, is he's got this secret communication going on with people who are in the know about classical plays or literature. If you're not a Hellenic Christian, you would never know these things. They would just go right over your head. And those are, they're just beautiful words. Or when he says, God does not live in temples made of human hands. It's a beautiful expression. It's from the Stoic philosophers, but it's also false biblically. So I find that a beautiful saying, but also proves how bad he is as a theologian, because God dwells in the temple at Jerusalem when he said that in Acts 17. And the temple didn't fall for another 15, 20 years. So he says a lot of beautiful things, but you just have to realize they're not always right or good.
All right, we're going to terminate the podcast at this point. We'll do the rest of this episode on podcast number 4. It's got another 30 minutes to go. And again, it's this open-ended questions about, how I got here and so forth. And that may help a lot of you to, have some sort of understanding of what kind of steps you might be going through or you need to go through to get closer and ultimately turn your life over to Christ properly, okay? And honestly and thoroughly. And that's what we're trying to do, is make us all disciples of Christ. And that's what he wanted. So let's all work on it together and help one another. All right, so look for the next episode, number 4, in a couple of days. All right, take care. Ciao, bye.